the previous sessions, we discussed the economic aspects of VPETs. Coming up next, we are going to have Professor Peter Noonan to talk about governance and performance in VPETs.
Professor Noonan is Professor of Tertiary Education Policy, the Mitchell Institute for Health and Education, and also the Professorial Fellow of Center for Research on International Education Systems in Victoria University of Australia.
Professor Noonan has played a major role in shaping policies in VETs, higher and post-compulsory education in Australia for over 25 years. He has just been appointed by the Australian government to the expert panel to review the legislation to regulation of VETs in Australia. Please welcome Professor Noonan.
Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation to speak at your very important conference. I've had a long and informal association, mainly with Hong Kong VTC, since when I stopped here for lunch with some colleagues when some of the qualification frameworks and standards and work were being done now many years ago. And I've seen friends and colleagues at many different conferences but never formally participated. And I must say, looking at the website and the program and the events, you really should be very proud of the organisation that you have built within Hong Kong VTC. Now, they say the time not to speak. In Australia, we refer to it as the graveyard shift. That is usually the speech last thing in the day when people want to just get away for some food and drink and some recreation. And then when you have the topic of governance, well, that is even more potentially boring. So I will try and make the subject as interesting as possible. And in the conversation, I would like to cover the following key issues. I think it is very important that we define what we mean by governance, because as we've heard from the previous speaker from Switzerland, governance in VET is a more complex thing than it is for many other organisations because of the intersection between government and industry, and because in many countries, such as Switzerland and Australia, we are dealing in countries which are federations. They are not unitary countries. I want to then talk briefly about how the principles of governance apply to VET specifically, and I'm using the term VET because that is the most commonly applied term in Australia and other places, but I do like the VPET terminology that Hong Kong has adopted. I want to talk about how we define successful performance, but in particular I then want to distinguish between performance of VET systems generally as systems and then how we define and measure performance at the provider or the institutional level, because I think there are important differences. Well, first of all, what do we mean by governance? Governance is often seen too narrowly to mean purely the administrative decision-making, the senior management, the board. But in fact, governance is much more than that. And broadly speaking, it's the arrangements by which the power of those in control of the strategy of an organisation and the direction of an entity, such as VTC, are both delegated and limited to enhance the prospects for the entity's long-term success, taking into account the risk in the environment within which it's operating. So governance in this sense has a very broad meaning. It covers all of the processes and decision-making functions of the organisation. It encompasses strategy, it encompasses the capacity and powers and capabilities of senior management and board members, the relationships between organisations, funding, regulation. It's the whole structure and all of the processes by which an institution, an organisation or a system is governed. And I'm sorry for this long quote, but I thought I would put it on one slide rather than two, and I think the organisers will make copies of the presentation available. Because a well-governed organisation will clearly understand what it's required to achieve and how it will be organised to achieve what it has to achieve. And you will find with many, what I find with many VET or VPET organisations in the countries I've worked in, is that some of them have got very clear and simple missions and strategies which are really linked to the core purpose of the organisation. And others have very woolly, unclear, blue skies kinds of visions, and it's all about enabling humankind and doing this and doing that. And then when you read it, you think, well, am I talking here about a professional training organisation, or am I talking about some other form of service delivery? Personally, I prefer very simple, straightforward, plain and practical definitions of what an organisation is and what it does, and then similarly, simple, plain and practical indicators, markers of progress, which means that the community and people can simply look, ministers, government, can then really see whether the organisation is doing its work or not. We talk about a governance framework, and I like this statement, which comes from a review of governance of statutory authorities in Australia. When working well, a governance framework produces better outcome simply because it exists. That may sound like a fairly straightforward and obvious statement, but as somebody who's worked in many organisations in Australia and worked with many organisations overseas, it is striking how often a good governance framework is missing from the organisations and how they are put together. And if I was asked to define the two most critical success factors for the performance of VET or VPET organisations, it would be this. It would be good governance and clarity of mission and purpose, and it would be engagement of industry and employers. If you have those two things working together, then I believe the chances of having a high-performing VET system or VET organisation are much higher. Now, we know internationally that governance arrangements vary significantly from country to country, and they also vary within countries. But generally they will cover the following things: the overarching legislation that establishes and confers powers on the entity in a VET system, including institutions delivering skills and qualifications. But importantly, and I really want to add this point, it also includes the policy, funding and regulatory arrangements that underpin the system. When we talk about governance, we should not only think about the governance of institutions, we have to think about the governance of all of the things that influence the way those institutions perform. We need to then understand the powers and functions of individual entities, the regulatory body, the funding body. How much discretion or autonomy does the principal of an individual institute campus have? Is there a governing council for an individual institution? And how does the governing powers of that council relate to the overall powers of the supervising body? And then we also need to understand the processes for the development, the provision, awarding and assessment of qualifications, how standards are set, how providers are accredited and how providers are registered. Because I've seen many examples of dysfunctional VET systems and VET organisations when the responsibilities for providing qualifications, for awarding qualifications, for assessment of qualifications, for setting standards are really unclear. So nobody, least of all employers, are happy with the ultimate outcome because nobody has overall responsibility and there's no clear system to do these things. I also find that governance arrangements vary according to the level of government responsible for VET. That's one point. And our previous speaker from Switzerland, wasn't that a fascinating example, where the fundamental responsibility for much of what happens with the VET system, with the dual system in Switzerland and in Germany, sits with the provinces or with the lander, but the federal government plays this really critical enabling supportive role which enables a national system to operate within a devolved structure. I would compare the Swiss and German systems, Germany in a federal system, with the Australian system, which is also a federation, but which has managed to establish a fairly strong national vet system of national qualifications and national standards. But compare that, for example, to the US or Canada, which effectively have no national systems at all and very limited mechanisms by which qualifications can be recognised or portable across jurisdictions. But another important indication or boundary around vet governance is the intersection with higher education and with schools. So again, in the US and Canada, you'll find that a lot of what would be described at this conference today as vet is offered through community colleges, which will tend to see themselves as being more related to the higher education system than to a vocational education or vet system, which in those countries doesn't really exist. And again, in many European countries, things that in Australia would sit outside of the school system in our technical and further education colleges and industry and private providers, in other countries they would sit more formally within the structure of secondary schools. In Australia that was the case, but we broke our vet system away from secondary schools to make it a distinct and different system. So the boundaries of vet in terms of governance are often not easy to define, particularly at an international level. They also vary a lot from highly devolved to centralised. And what I've found is that certainly in liberal democracies such as Australia and the UK, the governance arrangements for vet change as frequently as some people change their clothes. So you can move very quickly from highly centralised to highly devolved systems, or from devolved systems back to central systems. Now, regrettably, I think in Australia the tendency is to go back towards more centralised systems. There are reasons for doing this. I prefer devolved and autonomous systems because I think with the devolved and autonomous systems operating within a common framework of assessment and standards and qualifications, you get a lot more innovation and local ownership and local management of outcomes. Again, this point about the importance, and I think VET is quite unique in this, the integration of industry into governance in decision-making, standard setting, and through formal incorporation of the role of industry in apprenticeship provision, for example, the dual system in Germany and in Switzerland. In governance terms, this is actually would be called shared governance. In other words, government is really sharing the full responsibility of governance with industry, with recognised industry bodies, lander, chambers and so on. Australia and the UK have some of these features. Industry, of course, is heavily involved in the governance of VTC in this country and is in most countries. My own view is that the more strongly industry is involved in governance but takes responsibility for provision and for work placement and for apprenticeship, the stronger the system is. But it does add to complexity in terms of governance, because it means that how we measure success is critically dependent on the performance of employers, and employer decisions have a fundamental effect on system performance, as we've seen with that previous example of the Swiss system. In other words, governments in some countries are very proud of their vet systems in terms of what they've achieved, but the reality is they've achieved it mainly by building on the long-standing commitment of industry to high-quality vet systems, rather than it being purely a vet system built by government. Highly devolved vet systems are more difficult to govern, particularly in setting and monitoring national or system level objectives. What do I mean by that? Well, in a country like Australia, where we've got different states and territories and over 4,000 providers, some providers would not regard themselves as being part of a system. They may have an intersection with the system in terms of issuing qualifications or receiving some funding, but they effectively operate as fairly autonomous organisations. This, I think, is also characteristic of many universities. And it is difficult to define these highly complex organised systems with many organisations that can be highly competitive, differ a lot in size and location. They may not have anything to do with each other. Do we really describe them as a system? Because it's also difficult to establish clear lines of authority and accountability for organisations over whom you only have limited control or authority. Our experience in Australia has also been that when you go into market-based systems, that is setting up competitive training markets between public and private providers, this also presents real challenges for governance. Are private non-government providers only accountable to government for funding and for accreditation? Or should, as some people argue, they have a broader responsibility to the VET system in the same way that public providers do? This is a question that is very much under debate in Australia at the present time. Performance monitoring in a market-based system can present real challenges because in effect you're monitoring the performance and the standing often of private companies. They might be public companies who've actually got accountability to corporate regulators, or if they're family companies, the ability of government to look beyond a contract or an accreditation requirement to what the organisation is really doing is really very limited. You can't go into a family-owned company and do a whole lot of things that the legislation doesn't give you power to do. But that creates the very high risks of market failure because an organisation may appear at face value to be performing quite well, but in fact it may be running the risk of failing financially, or it might be doing things improperly which a public institution would be held much more accountable for and which would be much more closely monitored. Let me now just quickly talk about system versus provider level performance. Performance objectives must relate to the broader governance objectives of the organisation. In other words, what is the peak body, the peak organisation trying to achieve? But in doing that, we must then distinguish between system performance and the performance of individual institutions and providers. System level performance is focused on aggregate outcomes and outputs and can be measured against government policy objectives. And I'll give you an example in Australia because each year the Productivity Commission, which is an independent body, produces a report on government services for the Australian and the federal and state governments in Australia. And it includes a report on the performance of the VET system across several different dimensions. I hope you can read that. So there are objectives and then there's performance. And coupled between equity, effectiveness and efficiency, there's questions of access, appropriateness, quality and inputs. And in the middle column, participation rates, students who achieve the main reason for training, the level of employer engagement, student satisfaction, qualification completion rates, employer satisfaction and government spending per hour are all measures of system performance, and this is reported on an annual basis. It has been now for well over 20 years. What it means is that Australia has established a good process by which it can look at system level performance on a year-on-year basis. And in many countries what we find is, as with many countries we find, is that in fact the system performance overall has been relatively stable, but the funding per student and the overall funding levels are falling. In other words, similar outcomes are being produced with less and less funding. And there comes a tipping point, I think, where it is simply not possible to do that without better funding levels. And I think the next time that the Productivity produces the report on VET funding, that part of funding in Australia, a lot of commentators, including me, will be pointing to the decline in funding because it is publicly reported and it is well accepted data. Now, this is good information to have in terms of system level performance, but it tends to focus on system level outputs and outcomes. And I think there are major limitations in looking at system level performance in this way, because aggregate system performance can mask weaknesses by individual providers or groups of providers. In other words, if you have a lot of providers achieving very well and at the top end, but you have a very long tail and you have a small group of providers who are performing really poorly, very poor outcomes, poor standards, poor completion rates, poor student satisfaction and so on, then aggregate system performance means that you tend not to pick up the spread of performance across providers. And one of the challenges in Australia that we have is that even though we have very good performance measures and we have surveys and various data collections to produce that system performance, we have not yet found a way of getting sufficient data. The sample sizes at individual providers are not large enough to be able to monitor and publicly report on individual performances by individual providers in this national data. And I think that is a next step forward Australia must take. That's one point. The second point is that I would also contend, though, that when we look at system performance, we must define system performance broadly to include the effectiveness of inputs and processes and how they affect the performance of providers. In Australia and many other countries, there has been far too much focus on outputs, on looking only at outputs, thinking we don't care about inputs, we don't care what processes an organisation uses, as long as they produce good outcomes. Well, our experience has shown that you do have to care about inputs. You do have to care about the quality of curriculum. You do have to care about the quality of teachers. You do have to care about the quality of institutions. Because if you uncouple outcomes from the quality of inputs and processes, then outcomes can be achieved often in improper ways, through poor certification, poor assessment, poor practices in passing students, and often students won't report this because they don't believe it's in their best interest to reflect adversely on the performance of their provider. So we do need to care about the performance of the system across the board, inputs, processes and outcomes. So we also need to then be concerned about the performance of the entities that affect the performance of providers. Are the standards relevant? Are the competency standards up to scratch? Are the standards set by industry suitable for the 21st century, or are we simply teaching skills that were no longer used by many companies? Is the structure of qualifications sufficient? Are they too broad or too rigid? What is the performance of the funding and regulatory bodies? For example, in Australia, we fund providers on the basis of units of competence, how many units of competence they teach. But many people in providers say that this drives them to a fragmented and unit-based approach to how you deliver qualifications, and they argue we should return to funding more on the basis of whole qualifications. This is my view as well. I think you can actually do both. Is the funding sufficient? As I've said, the average funding rate per student and per qualification in Australia and many countries in VET has fallen. Does the funding flow to the providers in time? Do they have cash flow problems? Do we focus too much on completions and not enough on getting students properly prepared at the front end? And how do we assess that? I think you can devise performance management systems which look at the performance of the entire system and the governance of the entire system, not just the provider system. And as I've said, finally, the VET system should be defined broadly to include the role of industry. The level of investment in apprenticeship and in on-the-job training, I think, is a strong performance indicator of how well the system is performing. Just a few concluding points on institution level performance, because I know that from discussions with colleagues in Hong Kong and other countries, this is a common, the tension in this are a common issue. Standards for registering and accrediting vet providers are now commonplace in many countries across the world and in the Asian Pacific area, and Australia was one of the first countries to adopt this so that we could mutually recognise providers across a federal system. But there is always a tension in this between the use of quality assurance for regulation, audit and compliance, which is the primary reason for having standards, and for continuous improvement. Providers will tell you that if standards are only based about minimum compliance and about audit, and if you stray from the letter of the word, will the auditor have an adverse finding, means that people tend to be very unadventurous, they tend to be very black and white, they tend to be very literal about how they interpret a standard. The problem when you go too far the other way and use standards for continuous improvement is that the standards can then be very difficult to interpret. So if you do have a provider which is misbehaving or not doing the right thing, it can say, oh yes, but I'm continually improving. Well, the fact that it's actually improperly issuing qualifications is really not in the public interest. So it brings into question what is the role of government. Is it protecting students and the public interest and only ensuring the quality of vet qualifications? In a market-based system, is it to assist student and employer choice? Is it really the role of government to continually improve performance in providers, or is this more a responsibility for providers themselves and for professional associations? Can we have exactly the same framework for government entities, which are fully owned and controlled and accountable to government, and for non-government providers? In Australia, we have the same framework for public and private providers. And can the objectives of continuous improvement and audit and compliance be achieved within a single framework? Well, if you go back to the starting point around the purpose of governance, my view is that governance principles suggest that quality assurance should be defined broadly rather than narrowly, and they should include all of the institutions, all aspects of an institution's processes and systems. In other words, the quality assurance framework is about the entire operation of the institution as a provider, and it's about the entire operation of the entire system. In terms of compliance and audit, my view is that the role of government is to primarily focus on the assurance of the integrity of qualification, provision and certification. In other words, the primary job is to make sure that qualifications are being properly delivered, properly assessed and properly certified. And that's the primary role of government in this certification area. Now, whether government operates this broader quality assurance framework, it's run on a voluntary basis, on a co-governance model or something else, I don't really have a strong view. But I think when you try and confuse these two systems, you just end up with a problem, with confusion. If I was to introduce one reform in the Australian system, which I think would address a lot of these issues around quality, it would be to strengthen the assessment system, particularly moderation and validation of assessment by external parties. I think that would do away with a lot of the problems around front-end regulation. And the other point, and this relates particularly to Australia, is that these performance measures, student and employer satisfaction, employment outcomes, completion, student destinations and the whole raft of them must be reported and assessed at the institution level, not just at the system level. But to do that, the sample sizes must be sufficient. Now, one of the centres I'm working with is doing this for the Victorian system at the moment. Every employer and every vet student, we are constructing a sample of literally thousands of students and employers in order to try and build a provider performance picture which has got robustness in terms of the size of the samples. Because if you've only got few students in a sample, then the performances are unreliable. So some concluding comments. Good governance frameworks and good governance is critical to the success of VET. But that governance system must include directly and in an ongoing way the role of industry in the governance of the system. I think we need to think about vet system governance broadly, not narrowly. So we do think about the performance of all of the elements of the system, not just the provider system. My own view is that there is considerable benefit in having independent governance models, such as VTC, a statutory model with an independent board which is discharging the job given to it by government to carry out functions to some extent at arm's length from government. Performance systems and performance measures should drive and support continuous improvement and innovation and not just be concerned with regulation and compliance. And when we focus on compliance, we should be focusing primarily on the integrity of certification and qualification issuing. Two other final points. I believe that systems work well when the people who work in them and lead them have a passion and a commitment to the field in which they're working, in which they've committed them and to which they're committed to. If you have passionate, committed, well-motivated, publicly minded people who are committed to their industry and to getting good outcomes from students, then good governance will follow. How do we know when we've got good governance? Well, I'll conclude with a quaint old English saying, which is probably originally a Chinese saying, but I don't really know. So how do we know when we have good governance? Well, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. In other words, it should be very obvious, simply from looking at the organisation, that it is well governed, well run, well managed, well led, with good staff working in it, and the teachers and students will reflect that. And it's my belief, having visited many vet systems and been into many, many vet organisations over many years, that you can usually tell that pretty much within about 5 minutes of walking into a good organisation. And with those, I'm very close to the end, but I do have some time for a few questions, I think.